Ooh, people with the cameras on, that's nice.
Hello.
So you're not talking into the dark, John. That's always good.
Hello, John.
Okay.
Hello, Jari.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, I think we have quite a few people. The rest will join us later. Thank you all who have joined us here. We can't see all of your faces because that would have been too crowded, but we know you're there. I would really like to welcome John Yambo, who is a senior manager at Tilly Geography. It's a mouthful. John heads the company's data center research and keeps himself very busy tracking the capacity developments and the pricing trends in key global markets. Furthermore, John specializes in research on international transport and internet infrastructure developments, something that we all work on, and with a particular focus on Eastern Europe. And he also maintains the data sets for Tilly Geography's website, the internetexchangemap.com. Go visit that if you are interested in anything to do with exchanges. John is a regular speaker on the international conference circuit, chairing panel discussions, you might know him, and offering analyst presentations. One of his favorite conferences is PTC. Of course, that's in Hawaii. This virtual setup, let's have to say, is different, but it'll have to do. John will give us a 45-minute interactive tour around the new 2021 Internet Map as a whole, and we'll focus on what is happening in Europe, Eastern Europe, and hopefully also give us a bit of insight on the COVID effects. At the same time, John has promised us to tell us a little bit about how the map was made and the data set that is features in the map and the methodologies used, which is actually quite interesting. For those that don't know me, I'm Jerry Grondel. I'm one of the product managers within Analytics, and for this session, I'll be your moderator. Basically, that means that I'll read through all your comments in the chat, and I'll try to keep an eye on them and relay them to John as quickly as possible, if relevant. If you have other questions, you can chat away, but the relevant ones I'll pass on to John. And I think that if technically everything is okay, I'll give the floor to John.
All right, thanks so much, Jerry. Really appreciate it. And I really appreciate your moderation for this, because I'm going to be toggling back and forth between the screen and my full screen. And I want to share I'm going to share this application now so that you can see the presentation. Look good. Do you see the full presentation there, everyone?
This absolutely works, yes.
Okay, excellent. All right, so it's really a privilege to be able to share our latest internet map with you all with this NLIX event. Boy, that doesn't sound right at all. I don't think I'm going to go with pep on that. But I'm going to spend a little bit of time first talking about the background of how we put this together and what exactly we're depicting. Talk a little bit about the design elements, as Jerry said, and really what I want to spend the most time doing is tunneling into the data itself and showing you what we're depicting, and talk a bit about some of the trends that we see as we track this information. So right off the bat, I've already had some questions about what we're exactly depicting here, and so I want to get this clear right up front. So what we are showing on this map is international internet bandwidth. And so what that means is router to router public internet backbone. So that's going to immediately explain some of the obvious questions. You know, does this include the massive amount of content network capacity that we see? Does it include research education network international capacity? Does it include other private links? No, it doesn't. It does not include DWDM. We're not depicting submarine cables on this map. Now, if you're at all familiar with telegeography, you know that probably our most famous map is our submarine cable map, which we produce every year. This is not that, so you're not going to see those specific things on here. We're limiting this specifically to international internet, public internet capacity. So, and that also does not include domestic, which is why you're going to see some of the routes outsized that might be surprising if you were thinking of really where the most internet activity is. It's not the same as where the most internet activity is taking place. It's specifically where the major international links are. We're going to have a few figures talking about average and peak traffic, and you see the methodologies for that. And we'll have a few pricing figures too that are going to talk specifically about trends in 10 gig port IP transit pricing. So that's the quick explanation of what we are and are not showing. This is a list of some of the data.
John, just a quick question. I posted the link to the map in the chat here. What is your target group for this for the map mainly? Who do you focus on?
The target group is in the customer base.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, this is a broader focus in terms of just brand awareness than our typical studies, and I might be able to answer that a little bit better as I go through this. So let's keep that in mind for 1 second. So what feeds into the map is the research that we do on a daily basis. And as Jerry's mentioned, as Pep said, I'm one of our research analysts here. I'm not one of the map design guys. The maps are what we're known for by, to many people who may not know much at all about telegeography, but they're not our bread and butter. The core of what we do is research on international network development. And so the maps are just a nice visual way to kind of depict what we're tracking on a daily basis. So for this particular map, the core of the data that we're gathering comes from our Global Internet Geography Report. And when Pep talks about how labor intensive this is, that's not just on the design side. That's on the research side too. We're surveying operators to get to solicit data on their major international routes, looking at what their capacity and traffic levels are and aggregating that. We do a lot of supplementary stuff, doing our own trace routes and estimates to fill in the gaps. And that's just one of our studies. So, for this particular map, we have things coming in from our Internet Exchange map, our Cloud and Wind infrastructure pricing research. And so to kind of answer that question, our customer base, generally speaking, is really, anyone who's interested in, anyone who's investing on some major scale in international network development. So, our core customers tend to be carriers themselves, content providers, equipment manufacturers, data center operators, and government agencies and consulting groups. So that's our core customer base. But with the map, we kind of have this opportunity to kind of get the branding out further. So we typically will distribute these maps at conferences, sell them on the side, and they're kind of a nice way to sort of ease into some telegeography research without making a full spend on one of our research products. They're certainly far cheaper than that. So for people who are kind of interested in having a reference point, they might buy our maps. The maps show up in some pretty random places. The customer base, I would say, starts with our core customer base and kind of extends out from there to kind of get our brand awareness further out amongst those verticals. So this is what feeds into the map. And let's move on and talk about the design elements themselves. What I want to, so yeah, thanks, Jerry, for sharing the link to the actual map. Please feel free to toggle through that on your own as we go through this. If you notice, when you're on the interactive map, if you go to the top right, there are a couple of headers for each section that I'm going to zero in on, and it'll just take you straight to those sections: capacity, traffic, and pricing, and things like that. But let's just talk about the design elements quickly. Everything is going to be color coordinated by region. So anytime you see that yellow color, it will be something in Africa. Anytime you see orange, it'll be something in Europe. It'll follow that color code. Everything is scaled. And so this shows the basic scaling by gigabits or terabits on a metro connectivity level and on a route level. Here you see that depicted more fully in the full map. So when we talk about the scaling, it starts right with the regions themselves. So Europe is by far scaled the largest on this map, and that's because it has the most international internet connectivity of any region in the world. So then you see on the left there Asia, and then below that US and Canada, also quite large but a bit smaller, and so forth. The individual metropolitan hubs are scaled by the amount of connected international capacity. So you see the flat markets there in Europe are really outsized compared to the others on this map. And then you see the routes themselves depicted with thickness dependent on the amount of connected capacity between those metropolitan markets. So we're going to zero in and talk about some of the specific data there. The one other thing I would mention, well, really, I guess Pep has already kind of covered this for me, but this map design does date back to 2009. This is just one of several maps that we do. And as he said, the last time we did this particular one was in 2018. And for the record, you know, when he asked me if anything's changed, my answer was not exactly the way he characterized it. But things do change a little bit. And we have added some major elements to the charts as kind of we've seen shift in what's driving demand for international internet. But yeah, you know, fundamentally, the design is based on the same template. That template is the idea of hubs and spokes. So, and that really dates back even further in telegeography history to a study that we did as far back as 2000. So like 21 years ago, we did this study called Hubs and Spokes, really laying out the geography of telecom networks and talking about how there's this confluence of communications, connectivity, and traffic in major critical metropolitan hubs, and from there it tethers out to kind of logical nodes of interconnection that are dependent on those hubs. So in 2009, we made the first version of this internet map. That one is sitting at the Museum für Kommunikation in Frankfurt and on permanent display. And we've done different iterations of this map several years since then. I wasn't able to find it, but you know, we actually, I think one of the more unique ones that we did, a couple of years back, we actually had a glow-in-the-dark internet map that was based off of Tron. So I haven't been able to find a record of that one, but that was pretty cool. But we've done different iterations, and this is the latest one. So let's zero in on some specifics. We already talked about the scale of the regions and the colored, you know, the colored. Okay, so the colored part of the outer ring. So if you look at the circumference of each region, it's colored in partially for each region based on the amount of internet capacity that stays within the region. So clearly, a much bigger proportion of international internet stays within Europe than in any other region, which is kind of a powerful thing to think about. And we'll delve into that a little bit more. So the route colors shift according to where the routes are shared. So again, if it's completely intra-regional, it'll stay the same color. If it's shared, like the Frankfurt-Istanbul route, it changes from orange to pink to depict that connection to the Middle East. That numbering system that we saw on the key is so when you're talking about the top 50 or so hubs for international internet connectivity, they're ranked on the map directly. So here you see Budapest is ranked 22nd by our estimates for the amount of international capacity connected. So that's some of the design elements and the background. And if we don't have any specific questions about that, let's delve into the data itself. So starting broadly, looking at the amount of connected international internet capacity, by far the largest regional group that we track is intra-Europe. And so if we talk about this regionally, we track intra-regional routes as well as inter-regional routes. Intra-Europe dwarfs the next biggest route by 3x. We estimate about 300 terabits per second of international capacity connected within Europe. The next biggest route group is the intra-Asian route, which we estimate at less than 100 terabits per second. And then it goes from there. As far as largest international or inter-regional route groups, if you're talking country to country, a lot of those are connected to the U.S. So if you want to ask, okay, where's the connectivity to the U.S.? Well, if you go outside of your own region for international connectivity, the U.S. quickly becomes a focal point. And those biggest routes are on the U.S. to Latin America route, and then the Trans-Pacific and Transatlantic. The very biggest international country route by far is U.S. to Brazil. Now, again, we got to keep in mind, because that may come as a surprise, that we're not talking about domestic capacity. We're not talking about what the content providers are doing and how they add to that capacity, that overall underlying used bandwidth. We're talking specifically about public internet backbones. And that Brazil to US route is one of several examples where you still have this tromboning effect, where the routes are particularly large because you have a tremendous amount of dependence from one location to reach a different market outside of its region for international internet connectivity. So Brazil is still a big example of that. Now it's split up into various metropolitan routes, and the map itself depicts individual metro routes. So it's not abundantly obvious when you look at it. And actually this particular view is cut off there. What's really readily apparent when you look at this is the really big metro to metro routes. And you see that tight interlink between the flat markets there. You see the size of Frankfurt to Moscow, Frankfurt to Istanbul, which also, like the Brazilian routes, has this heavy tethering effect back to Frankfurt. And over here you see, in Asia, you see this massive Singapore Jakarta route, which is one of the fastest growing routes in the world. So let's tunnel in a little closer and look at what's happening in Europe specifically, because I promised I would focus on that for the NLIX audience here.
James, before we dive into Europe, I've got a question more on the general layout of the map. What actually decides what metro area gets listed here? The exact question from James Blessing was, why on earth is Liverpool appearing as a point on the map? Manchester is the end of the world for connectivity between networks.
Well, yeah, and I don't know specifically, but I think that's here's my biggest guess is that that would have to do with where underlying subsea connectivity is, and we're just depicting the router to router last hop between international destinations.
So that's it, the international destination.
Yeah, so that's going to throw it off a little bit, because yeah, Manchester would be bigger, but that would be a domestic route, Liverpool to Manchester or London to Manchester.
Okay.
That's why.
Okay. James has some other questions, so maybe if you run to him at the social, then it could be a nice topic to continue on.
Okay. Sounds good. Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, and admittedly, and there will be some anomalies because of that, but by and large, I think you're going to see mostly very, very relevant international connections based on actual activity, based on actual public internet activity within those markets. That is certainly an odd example. All right, so zooming into Europe, so 75%. We saw that the coloration in that outer ring. 75% of international European connectivity stays within the region. That's really extraordinary when you consider that the next largest percentage is intra-Asia at just 56%. The size of the flat markets is really extraordinary. And you look at the ranking numbers, it's 1 through 4 for the largest hubs globally. So this goes a long way in explaining why we see more international connectivity in Europe than anywhere else. You have the very largest markets very tightly intertwined and very interdependent. And you see other regional markets heavily dependent on these markets. And for networks outside of these core hubs, there's not a heck of a lot of need to go outside the region, because really anything you need to connect to is here, and increasingly going out closer to the edge too, which we'll talk about. Let's move to some of the infographs. And if you're looking at the interactive map, you can just click the capacity toggle at the top, and it will swoop you right down to this figure. We see this major surge over the last year, unsurprisingly. We'll talk about the COVID effect a little bit. 35% growth in capacity just in the last year. And that really outpaces the growth of previous years quite a bit. Those line charts on the right there, just want to point out again, this is another depiction that by far the largest amount of connected regional capacity is connected to Europe. Now this goes outside of that intra regional route grouping and really is a depiction of all capacity connected to these regions. Europe is still by far the largest for international bandwidth. And then I'd also note that in about 2019, Asia surpassed North America in terms of the amount of interconnected bandwidth. Now, there's a couple reasons for this. So, again, keeping in mind, we're just talking about international and we're just talking about public internet. We have seen a shift away from dependence on the US for international internet access. Certainly not entirely, but there's been a steady decline over the years from most regions, with the exception of Latin America, which, despite the fact that you see all these new subsea cables with all these diverse routes, there's still a tremendous priority to have access to the US for international network connectivity from Latin America. So the proportion there is much higher than for elsewhere. But if you look at Europe, Africa, Middle East, Asia, Oceania, you're going to see a decline across the board in the amount of capacity, international capacity, that's connected to North America. In the case of Asia, a lot more of it is intra-regional. The ecosystems are becoming highly developed there, and you're seeing much more of a shift towards reaching places like Singapore and Hong Kong. In the case of the Middle East and Africa, you're seeing this precipitous drop in connectivity to America. It makes far more sense to go to Europe, which is really feeding into that explosive growth that we see in the flat markets as well. So that's looking at some of the specific hubs. Again, this really reinforces that. These are the top 10 hubs for international internet globally. And the flaps plus Singapore, these are by far the dominant hubs. What I think is really interesting to point out here is that you see that proportion of connectivity that's either intra-regional or connected with other regions. Many of these are really heavily focused intra-regionally. So there's a heavy amount of connectivity within their own regional markets. But there are some exceptions. So you look at Miami, that's very telling. I mean, I think there's a teeny tiny sliver of connectivity elsewhere there. Maybe it looks like Europe, but a vast majority of the international connectivity for Miami is connected to Latin America. And that's because Miami really still serves as the remote hub of Latin America, despite the fact that Sao Paulo and Rio are really growing dynamically. There's still a tremendous connectivity happening in Miami. The other exception I want to highlight is Marseille, where a majority of its connectivity actually goes outside of the European region. And that's really due to its strategic positioning in the subsea world. So you have tremendous amounts of capacity connected to the Middle East, to Asia, and down to Africa as well. This chart kind of splits by region and looks at some of the major hubs and talks about the 5-year compounded annual growth in internet connectivity and international internet connectivity. So again, the circles are scaled by the amount of connected connectivity, and the numbers show you the pace of growth. I'll hone in a little bit on some specific regions, but really quickly, just to highlight a couple of random examples across the map. Dallas and Seattle, well over 30% or over 30% compound annual growth there. Seattle with its connectivity that is to the Trans-Pacific and to the Asian markets. Dallas with growth and connectivity to Mexico. Where else did I want to show? South Africa. So, you have 71% compound annual growth for Johannesburg, almost 50% for Cape Town. And this is another one of these markets where you have this massive tromboning effect. This is, so with what we're tracking, I think there's a couple of things that you really want to keep in mind. This shows both the dynamic demand for access to global networks from these locations, but for many of these places, it may also be an indication of how heavily they're dependent on access to other markets. And so it's, it can be quite a good metric for determining where more localized interconnection infrastructure should be developing, and maybe isn't quite there yet. So in cases like Joburg and Cape Town, you still have this massive tromboning effect with connectivity up to Frankfurt. And similar to what we see in Brazil. And I was going to point out to Istanbul, same deal. 36% growth there. That's connectivity to Frankfurt. And sorry, I guess with South Africa, that would probably be more to London, Istanbul to Frankfurt. Let's look at a couple of specific regions. I've done some studies recently on the kind of growth that we're seeing in the APAC region in particular. This is a really interesting time in that region. And you have a confluence of things going on, I think, with network advancements, the natural growth and demand outside of the core hubs there. You're seeing a surge in demand for access to these major hubs, but at the same time, you're seeing troubling signs within those hubs, and it's causing a lot more questioning as to where else interconnection infrastructure should be developing. Jakarta is one of these really hot markets in that regard, despite clear signs of volatility that really have not gone away. There's still such tremendous potential, and there's kind of this sense that some of these markets, Jakarta, Bangkok, and others, really need to develop, regardless of underlying conditions that are troubling. At the same time, for major hubs, Hong Kong and Singapore continue to have explosive growth. You still have this massive tethering to these locations as you see more international connectivity for Asia shifting intra-regionally. They are still heavily contributing to growth in Singapore and Hong Kong. And that's even despite the signs of decoupling from Hong Kong, even despite the signs of perhaps overdevelopment in Singapore, and kind of the discussions or the regulatory discussions happening around that. Shifting back over to Europe, I wanted to just point out that we continue to see, and we have seen for several years, outsized growth in Marseille and Sofia. It's interesting that, as we look elsewhere in the world, I think people are looking for the next Marseille. I think there are other regions of the world that could benefit from sort of this intermediate transit point that becomes sort of a hub unto itself. But it's a challenging thing to find, and the conditions have to be right. And it certainly seems to have worked out well for Marseille. And we see explosive traffic growth there. And frankly, the internet traffic to Marseille now exceeds even that seen in Stockholm. So when it comes to traffic, internet traffic, Marseille, by our estimates, is now the 5th largest market in Europe, and will soon become the 5th largest as well when it comes to the amount of connected capacity. So let's talk about those traffic levels too. So real quick, I just wanted to note the what we say here about utilization levels. It's interesting that you have this kind of threshold where people say they will start to supply more network. Once you get to a certain level of utilization, you upgrade, and generally most operators would start that upgrade once sometime after peak utilization hits 60%. But in reality, the utilization levels that we see vary quite a bit across different markets. They're really low in Europe, as you see in that line chart over on the left at the bottom, and higher, more in the 50 some odd percentile for most regions. So that gives you a sense of really what level of utilization networks are running at before there's upgrades. And in Europe in particular, there's far more capacity provisioned for internet than is needed and utilized even at peak levels. Going to the top there, those traffic levels.
John, just a quick question.
Yes.
The nerdy question has to be asked. What do you call peak traffic? Is that 95 percentile or real?
It is. Yeah, you know what? I didn't want to read it out because it gets really complicated. But if you go back to the methodology slide, the term is spelled out. So average is let's see, it's all the traffic in a month divided into seconds and then averaged, and then the peak takes the top 5% and weeds that out, if that makes sense. So yeah,
yes,
yeah, that's what it is. Yeah, yeah. So that's what we're depicting here. Yeah, so that the traffic levels there that you see at the top, again, similar to capacity growth, the traffic bump that we saw last year exceeded the capacity bump, which means that utilization levels were higher too across the global internet. And we saw a surge of nearly 50% year on year. All right, so let's talk about that COVID effect. Before COVID hit, we had forecasted about a 28% growth in peak traffic levels globally, and what we actually observed was a lot closer to 50%. So, of course, we've talked to many operators over the course of the year to get their assessment on what they're seeing, whether they, how they expect things to shift long term as a result of this, and what's really driving the traffic level growth. And by and large, the answers that we're getting are they think this is mostly a one-off thing, where the traffic levels have surged, but they're going to kind of sit at this higher level and continue to grow at a more normal rate from that. And then in terms of daily utilization with peering, they're, by and large, they're telling us, and many of you will know this far better than me, that there's kind of more sustained peak traffic levels throughout the day as opposed to seeing typical daytime and nighttime fluctuations. As far as what's driving this stuff and why we saw such huge increases in traffic, cloud and hyperscale are, the consistent content. But really, carriers, gaming services, government services, remote educational provisioning, things like that, all major drivers of this traffic growth that we've seen in networks and data centers and on peering platforms. It's interesting that depending on what kinds of carriers we're talking to, they were more or less ready for this. So I think there were a lot of the big international backbone, kind of the more wholesale providers who had already done these massive 100G upgrades and were utilizing their networks at these really low levels. And so when the surge hit with COVID, they hardly batted an eye. Whereas for some of the ISPs, there was a lot more scrambling going on. So this is what we've seen, and it's expected to kind of return to normal as our lives return to normal, hopefully.
John,
Yeah.
you've seen a lot of traffic, of course. That's your main focus. Do you get any insights on whether people are eating up on their redundancy levels, or whether they're now building up their backbones just in order to sustain this sort of traffic levels? Is that sort of the detail that you've gone into?
Yeah, I think so. Again, I think that there have been a number. I don't have a really deep window into that, but from the conversations I've had, I think it's all, like I said, I think it's a mix. There are some operators that have already made these massive underlying capacity upgrades, and it's just not hard for them to switch on more internet capacity. But then there are others who are kind of fundamentally looking at how their networks are laid out and what this means long term, and are doing a lot more underlying fundamental capacity planning for the long term as a result of this anomaly. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so let's switch over to pricing briefly. And again, we're talking about 10 gig Ethernet IPT pricing here. So, the picture is, of course, always consistent and either, bleak if you're a network provider, or great if you're a customer, I guess. Constant erosion, the rough pace of global price erosion is around 24%. That varies a lot by markets, and so that line chart, I'm going to toggle between this line chart and the map that shows the actual price points here. Actual price points and actual rates of erosion across different markets vary a lot. If you're in Europe or the US, basically everything is in essence on net, and you have these commoditized pricing rates where you have a similar mix of operators provisioning similar level of service. And even out there in Moscow, you're going to have a pretty comparable rates to what you would see elsewhere in Europe. And I'm sure many of you would say, well, the prices are actually lower than this. This is just, weighted median prices reported to us, and they don't factor in massive discounts. So keep that in mind. These are benchmark rates, and certainly there's a lot of fluctuation beyond what you see here. In terms of markets with really good price erosion right now, Sao Paulo and Johannesburg, they're still pretty high priced, but you look at the price there in that mustardy color there on the right for Johannesburg, and it's plummeting as it becomes more competitive. Markets where you are starting to see this kind of getting under this threshold of about $1 a meg, Mexico City, again, Sao Paulo, Singapore, Hong Kong are getting into that kind of competitive realm there of around $1 a meg and going down. The other big thing I want to point out here, though, is Mumbai. As critical as that market is, as much as we're seeing tremendous interconnection infrastructure development in that market, you're seeing lots of data center development, IX network. Those prices are still, for IP transit, are still resolutely high, and they're not eroding very fast. So that global average is 24% compounded annually. It's only like 11% in Mumbai. And that's at least largely because of the cost of backhaul on the subsea side, which is kind of baked into that. Dramatically enough, if you're looking at pricing along the Europe-Asia route, both because of the expense of backhaul to Mumbai and because of the deals you can get on express routes between Europe and Singapore, it's actually transport costs are actually cheaper going from Europe to Singapore than dropping off in Mumbai, and that's, I think, reflected in those transit costs too. Let's talk a little bit about exchanges, which you guys certainly know a lot more about than I do. This is coming directly from our Internet Exchange map data, which shows more than 600 IX platforms in at least 1,500 building pops worldwide. So all I really want to point out here, well, a couple of things. Yeah, there's peak traffic levels there for DKICs and AMSICs. How quickly things change, right? So, you know, around 7 or so terabits per second peak traffic. When we had gathered this data, this was probably late last year or in the fall. You know, I checked this the other day, and they're both at around 10 terabits per second now. So growing really fast. And as we said, we're seeing this surge in peak traffic volumes across major exchanges globally as networks scramble to provision more cross connects and ports to accommodate more virtualized world during COVID. And that's been a consistent story across the board. You know, while we see, you know, on varying levels, new infrastructure continuing to come online, a lot of the surge in growth is within the data center and at the exchange level. You're seeing more cross connects, you're seeing more ports being provisioned. And I'm sure that many of you have been very busy working precisely on this. In terms of where we're seeing development, that figure in the lower right, it's global. And we've seen, you know, the past 5 years, these are just depicting new IXs coming online by region. And the spread has been quite global. That's very much a mix of local operators, many of whom are provisioning IX connectivity for the first time in a new market. And as we all well know, it's also this big trend in the major exchanges deploying their exchange platforms and their expertise to different parts of the globe. And that has not slowed down at all. We're expecting to see a lot more activity in that regard with at least a couple of major providers. The last thing I'm going to talk about here before opening it to further questions, although by all means, feel free to stop me if I'm moving too fast and you want to slow down and focus on something. So cloud infrastructure, and this is something that we've, this is one of the things that's very much new since the last time we did this map 3 years ago. We've been tracking the tremendous influence of cloud on overall network and interconnection market development over the past several years. And of course, their influence is, their fingerprint is everywhere. They are driving underlying transport network development. The major cloud providers account for the most capacity utilization on the major subsea routes, you know, dwarfing internet usage on the transatlantic and transpacific routes and the intra-Asian route and others. So wherever they are going, wherever these cloud providers are going, you can bank that that's going to be a place of interest for other interconnection players too. And for us, it's a really intriguing benchmark for looking at real demand. You know, sometimes when you see maybe development in a data center or IX or network, on some level, it may be a little bit speculative, but that's not the case when you see development happening with these major cloud platforms. Wherever they're going, you know, that's where they immediately need to address something, where they need to reach local users with lower latency than where they're currently providing their services from. And so that starts with these smaller on-ramp footprints with where they need to jump into colo facilities and have that edge server footprint and get people onboarded to dedicated connectivity to some other cloud region. And then you can also see it much further when they get to the point where they're developing full cloud regions and data center zone clusters. And at that point, you know, the level of demand is really big, and there needs to be this whole level of support infrastructure around that. You've got to have a strong, robust, and redundant set of data centers and IX platforms in order to provision that.
John, I think you've already sort of answered the question. Just to make it more specific and answer a question here in the chat, do you expect? The question is, do you expect a sudden jump in traffic from edge clouds? But I think the more correct question would, based on what you've said, just be: do you see a shift in traffic whenever a cloud deploys somewhere? or is
Yeah,
it
that's a good
additional
question.
traffic?
Yeah, that's a good question. I wouldn't be able to comfortably answer that because we're just not tracking the shifts on that granular a level. I think overall, but I think yes, in a way, because overall we'll see what we'll see year on year is this growth in traffic levels, and that would certainly be at least to some degree informed by where new cloud on-ramps and regions are developing. I mean, if you look at where we're seeing the biggest route growth levels, on some level, you're certainly seeing a strong parallel with where you're seeing these cloud platforms developing. But in terms of drawing a direct line, I wouldn't be quite as comfortable conjecturing. So what we're depicting here is both availability zones and on-ramps, and I gotta catch myself on that figure on the left with availabilities. And keep in mind, this is the actual individual data center clusters. So Microsoft, Google, and Amazon there all have pretty comparable numbers. If you look at the actual regions covered, Microsoft covers far more regions, but their deployment model is also very different, because anytime they go into a new location, they're going to deploy geographically separate regions in fairly close proximity, which ups the number of regions. Their number of individual zone deployments within those regions will be lower, though. So it kind of comes out in a wash, and you have this comparable number of zones developed by those three major platforms there. And again, quite a mix globally. In terms of on-ramps, Amazon and Google are scrambling to deploy on-ramps all over the world. I just want to end by showing an example of one of the footprints, and this shows Amazon's on-ramps as the black dots and zone deployments in the colored circles by region. We have 6 of these on the map for all of the major cloud providers that we're tracking here. And the big thing I would point out here is that, since we deployed this map, you'd have to add several more planned zones to it. I mean, there's 2 depicted here. We'd add another 4: Osaka, Zurich, Hyderabad, and Melbourne. And that's just for Amazon. If I'm calculating this correctly, just among the 3 biggest cloud providers, if we're looking at Amazon, Google, and Microsoft, we're currently seeing about 34 new planned regions that haven't been deployed yet, and Microsoft actually has the majority of those, about 17. So that is a quick tour of our global internet map for 2021, and just to reiterate where you can find it, if you want to browse the online version, if you don't already have it open, Jerry has put it in the chat window. This is the link. If you'd like to purchase a wall version of this map, you can click on this link here and get access to that. Yeah. And with that, Jerry, I'm going to turn it over to you.
I think I still have 2 questions for you.
Sure.
If you could, we can do that later. One would be, I know that you can't monitor everything, but we've got a lot of high-speed access technologies rolling out, whether it be fiber, 5G, or the new DOCSIS standards. Have you been able to spot any difference on the backbone capacities due to this rollout?
That's a really good question, and I'm afraid I don't know the exact answer to that. As far as what are the specific drivers contributing specifically to that. But again, I think with the decentral, what we do see is that this generational upgrade, across the board from 10 to 100 to beyond 100, and that all those things, 5G, and everything else that requires edge node access is feeding into that. Okay,
and the other question would be for next year, for next year's map. Yeah. Could you have a look at what Brexit is doing?
Oh, that'll be interesting. Let me get back to my. I'll have to get back to you on that. We have an office in the UK, and there might be a bit of sensitivity on that. I don't know.
No, it's something that we've all been monitoring here in Europe, of course. So that's if there's any topic that comes up that's related, we'd be very happy to have you back. It's been very insightful. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and thank you for covering the time difference as well.
No problem.
So for anyone that has any questions, detailed questions for John, he's just shared his contact details. So I think John will be happy to answer your questions himself, or refer you to one of his colleagues. So that's I know that there is a lot more information behind these maps than what's actually just been talked about. And you may also be able to find John in the social bits that we can now hop into. There has been a link here in the chat already, and actually everywhere else. You may even have an email. We're now going over to our islands on the Meebo platform. It should be a simple click. There you go. It's there. getmebo.com. And if you can't find the link, we're all happy to share it with you. Log in and check one of the islands, and you should be able to find friends. It's all self-explanatory. Have fun. Thank you, John.
Thank you.